And now, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We will begin the Harnessing the Potential of Citizen-Generated Data for Well-Being. I would like to invite the panelists, the moderator, and as well as the speakers up onto the stage. Please greet them with a big round of applause. And now the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm so pleased to see so many joining us for this session on harnessing citizen-generated data. I think it's probably one of the most exciting topics that we have here to discuss in this beautiful place of Incheon. My name is Johannes Jütting. I'm the Secretariat Manager of Paris 21, which stands for Partnership in Statistics for Development in the 21st Century. Now, our partnership main focus is to strengthen statistical capacities in poor countries, in low-income countries, and we work mostly with national statistical offices all over the world to help them to produce more and better data. And you may ask yourself, why does Paris 21, why are we involved in citizen-generated data, and why should we think about it? And stepping back a second, I think the SDGs, the Agreement on the Sustainable Development Goals with the Agenda 2030, has put a lot of pressure, as you all know, for national statistical offices to produce the data needed to underpin the goal framework. And as we all know, we are looking for different data sources, and we are speaking about big data, we are speaking about various forms of big data, and in this context also the citizen-generated data has come up as a possible source for informing us about the progress and the monitoring of the SDGs. But also the issue of citizen-generated data has come up as an additional source next to big data. And I think one of the conversations we will be having here with my great panelists is, what actually do we mean by citizen-generated data? Is citizen-generated data data that is coming involuntarily from citizens while driving cars, for instance, in citizens, and they get sort of from census, we can produce data from the citizens while driving cars? Or is citizen-generated data coming from surveys that citizens might just do, or civil society organizations, satisfaction surveys, auditing? And I think it will be interesting at some point to discuss what exactly we do understand by citizen-generated data. To some extent, if we look at the current debates, and in a very stylized way, we might see two opposing views of the usefulness of citizen-generated data. And the one view, it could be labeled like the more negative view or the challenging view. And this, from a perspective of a national statistical office, could go as follows. It could say, well, it's all nice to have all these citizen-generated data coming up, but this is a huge competition for us. We are challenged by all these data coming from citizens, and I look at Lisa Bersales, whom I will introduce in a minute, from the Philippines. I recall some years ago, we did a workshop in the Philippines on inclusive growth, and at that time, there is a slightly well-known civil society organization called Social Weather Station, and they produce poverty data on a yearly basis. And this, to some extent, was challenging the National Statistical Office, because to produce official statistics on poverty took a bit more time. So there is a lot of On the side of the NSO, it could be seen as a little bit of suspicion, competition. There is the issue of quality of that data. And the same goes for civil society organizations. They could also say, why should we team up with national statistical offices? This is, on the one hand, is the government. There's the issue of sort of sharing that data with the official government could lead to breaching privacy concerns. It could lead to a sort of reputational issues. So why at all should we think about this? Why at all should we be thinking about working more closely together? On the other hand, though, and I think this is the approach we want to take here, I think we see more the positive opportunities of bringing civil society-generated data or citizen-generated data together with national statistical offices. And we had heard over the last 2 days already a couple of examples where through citizen-generated data, you could make an improved official statistics, or you could improve the knowledge base for society at large. I happened to participate in a session on smart cities where it was very clear that satisfaction surveys about how you feel about public transport or satisfaction surveys about health issues are a great source of information that combined with official statistics could be a great tool for policymakers to do policies that both speak to their citizens and are statistically valid. So there is a lot of potential maybe for augmenting official statistics with civil society data. And the question is, how do we do it? What are the current bottlenecks? What stands in the way? And how can we overcome? So with these few words of introduction, I hope by the end of this session, we will be able, together with you, to identify a couple of entry points of how we can harness these citizen-generated data for the better of public good and public policy making, and for well-being of a society. Now, how are we going to do it? We will have first a 10 minutes intervention by our great panelists. And then I will follow up with 1 or 2 questions before I will open the floor to your questions, to your comments, to your ideas. So it would be of great help if throughout the different presentations you can already take note. And if we come to the moment I will open up the floor, I will be most happy to give you the floor, and we will do it by microphone this time. So you can just give me a sign, and we will have running mics, and we will collect questions before having the panelists a last round of comments, and we are wrapping up. This is the plan for this session. Again, let me now start to introduce our first panelist. The first panelist is Jane Badet. She is the Assistant Chief Statistician, Assistant Deputy Minister from the Social Health and Labor Statistics Canada. So we will start to hear from Jane about how Canada is thinking and using citizen-generated data. Jane.
So good morning, and thank you for inviting Statistics Canada here to talk about this important topic. So I'm going to make a positive case for using citizenship or citizen-generated data in a national statistical office with some qualifications. I think as we modernize the statistical agencies, we have to look at alternative data. And this is one area that we can look at. So I'm going to walk you through the Canadian experience. But first to say, citizen-generated data is everywhere. Every citizen now can produce their own data. They share data. They do a restaurant review, sharing photos of their latest holidays. And I would say that citizens are understanding the power of this data to, in fact, impact social change and change around environmental issues, change around well-being. So you may be asking yourself, why is this the case? And the answer is probably right in front of you. It's the smartphone. The majority of the world's population has access to the greatest data gathering invention ever, and that's the smartphone. Technology now enables citizens to capture information, share it in real time. Beyond the smartphone, citizens are finding new ways to harvest data sets or data from websites, images, and sensors. And they're doing it around issues sometimes. But let me just walk you through some of the pros and cons. So in Canada, for example, in Toronto, there's a company, Sidewalk Labs, a division of Alphabet company, beginning to test the use of data on traffic, noise, quality of life, performance of systems to guide operations within where citizens reside. So this could be a potential data for lots of, to inform many topics such as citizens' well-being. But I can tell you right now in Canada, it's actually causing some issues. And there's issues around governance of data, privacy, and who owns the data. I won't talk about that much today, but perhaps it will come out in our conversations. So citizen-generated data are powerful. They're generally cost-effective, they're responsive, they can deal with very real-time issues, and they generate data in real time. They're open, and you can get a lot of information very quickly. So all of these attributes are very attractive to a statistical agency and statistical organizations who have been dealing with these issues for 100 years. We hear from our users they want real-time data, more timely, more granular data. They want local-level data. So citizen-generated data is a great source of that. They can check all those boxes. But there are strengths, there are also limitations. Some of this data usually has a bias. It makes inference to a larger population difficult. The breadth of the information that can be collected is limited, so you can't really fully have the full picture of all the data around a specific topic or the complexity of a topic. The data are often used or collected using unique frameworks, limiting the ability to integrate data with other data sets. And there has to be a reason, there has to be a cause for citizens to provide the data often. If that reason or cause goes away, so does the data. So while the limitations are there, I do believe national statistical organizations can work in partnership with NGOs, other governments, to really overcome some of these challenges and limitations and maximize the use of the data to really provide key information on topics that matter to citizens now. So here's an example of what Statistics Canada did. So we crowdsourced, and we crowdsourced around the price of cannabis. So I know you see a funny picture, a cartoon here. We had to measure Canada's cannabis economy. So I'm going to give you some background. In 2016, the Government of Canada announced that it was going to legalize in Canada the production, consumption, and distribution of cannabis. In fact, it's legal now. So you can imagine this is wide-ranging social and economic implications. But when we looked at it from the statistical agency, from Statistics Canada, we had no data. We had a complete lack of information. So we knew that we had to look at where we could get information, how to start capturing this in the statistical system. And it was illegal. It was a product that was illegal. So one critical piece of information that was missing was the price of illegal cannabis. The price in many ways determines consumption. Consumption in turn impacts the well-being of citizens. So here we were in Canada, at Statistics Canada, saying, how are we going to do this? How are we going to ready our statistical system for this really major change in Canadian society and in the economy? So we had a problem. There was no store we could visit, no business we could ask a survey of. We had no scanner data to bring in the price, which we usually do for our CPI, Consumer Price Index. We couldn't scrape. There weren't many websites to scrape. So none of our traditional methods applied. So we had a novel idea. What if we just asked people? And that's what we did. So we set up a crowdsourcing website. We asked people to tell us what price they were paying for cannabis, why were they purchasing it, how often they used it, how did they consume it. So we took a gamble, and submissions were completely anonymous, and they were open source, so open data by default. So what happened? So we were a little bit lucky too. So this was January 2018, so this was the beginning of this year. So we launched the site on the website, Stats Canada. We also had a number of national news organizations found out, thought this was pretty cool, and you saw that cartoon that was done. We were known in Canada as Stats Canada, and they called it Stats Cannabis. So yeah, it's pretty cool to work at a statistical agency these days. So they picked it up, and so you can see the spike at the beginning of brought Canadians to this. So that helped us. There was a cause, there was interest. So since we've launched it, we've had over 20,000 submissions. Our general social survey is 20,000 sample, so it's quite large. We weren't collecting any personal information, but we could tell whether the information was from a single individual or a group. So of the 20,000, over 17,000 were from unique devices. So how did we transform this 20,000 plus data points into information Canadians could use that had quality? What tools were we using to do this? And I would argue that national statistical agencies, organizations have a lot of tools. Sometimes they don't realize all the tools they have in their tool set. So how did we ensure the quality of this citizen-generated data? We were able to compare the coverage of the crowdsourced data with our census by our population, and we had also administered a number of health surveys, population health surveys, which we had asked about consumption and prevalence. So we were able to benchmark that data. So we could determine all of those, and especially at geographical levels, how representative. Also, we were able to assess the quality of it in different ways. So one of the cautions, I would say, of using citizen-generated data is the possibility that individuals who do not support the cause provide spurious results. But we had a rich toolkit. So we developed an outlier detection routine, so we could basically flag this on the data set that we had. About 1,500 were suspicious. So we let users know of the data set. We were able to embed in existing questionnaire methodology, and in the design of the application, standard classification systems. So we ensured that the data that we were collecting was more or less comparable. It was representative to the trends that we saw elsewhere from our traditional sources. Then we created what we call a cannabis statistics hub on our website, where we combine the information with other data right on the website. So users could come and they could see the value of this information and how, kind of guide them in appropriate use. So that was our experiment. I'm going to conclude, but say that crowdsourcing or citizen-generated data may not replace your traditional methods, but I do believe the combination of those traditional methods and the citizen-generated data is extremely useful, and it really is the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jane. This was a fantastic starting presentation for this session, because you also provided us with a very powerful definition in the beginning. And then also this looking at this interesting example of the price of cannabis, which you wouldn't necessarily think about in the first place when we talked about well-being and SDGs. So that was quite an interesting story. This is, I mean, we have to say, you coming from Statistics Canada, which is, I think we can say, one of the most modern statistical offices in this world. Now we will hear from the Philippines, and I'm very happy to introduce the Vice Minister and National Statistician and Civil Registrar General, Dr. Lisa Bersales, who will give us a perspective from the Philippines. The Philippines is also known as a statistical office which is very open and very innovative. And the Philippines have a very vibrant civil society, so it will be very interesting to see from a very different part of this world how you think about the usefulness and how we can harness possibly more citizen-generated data in the Philippines. Lisa, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Yanis, and I'm very pleased to be part of this distinguished panel. I would like to start first by putting a clear definition of citizen-generated data as I present them. So citizen-generated data is defined as data that individuals or civil society organizations or nonprofit organizations produce to be able to demand, inform everyone, or drive change to improve their well-being. What do we have in the Philippines for information and statistics? We have our usual official statistics, of course. We report quarterly on the economic performance of the whole country. We report every year on the economic performance of the subnational areas in the country. The country has 17 regions. So we report on how they're doing in economic performance every year. We also report monthly on inflation. We report quarterly on labor force. We report annually on indicators of poverty. So these are the non-income indicators. And we report every 3 years on income-based poverty statistics. What else do we have in the Philippines? As Yanis mentioned, we have a very vibrant, active civil society. We also have a very engaged media using information, statistics, data. So citizen-generated data, as I defined earlier, exists in the Philippines. But these are generated by the different groups by themselves. So there is no cooperation, there is no coordination with the statistics office. But they are vital to our officials because the officials listen to them. So what do we have in the Philippines as citizen-generated data? I have here some examples, but I would like to show you first that our central bank produces what is called the Consumer Expectation Index. And actually, it's the statistics office that does the survey for them. So the central bank commissions the statistics office to do the survey, but it is the ownership of the central bank. So it's their product, and so they report on the results. I'd just like to say that in the last economic performance report we have, specifically GDP, for the second quarter of this year, we noted that household consumption expenditure has been at its lowest in the past so many years. This means that our households are not consuming. And this consumer expectation indicator of the central bank is giving us the same information, that the pessimists are more than the optimists now in terms of consumer spending. So aside from the statistics office, we have these kinds of information from other government offices. But let me go to citizen-generated data. We have actually two big nonprofit polling groups. They actually have commissioned surveys where they are being paid for the surveys they do. But they have what they call service to the country. They do surveys without profit, without anyone commissioning them to do it, and this is for the country. And so one example is this survey that they actually do on hunger. This is actually self-rated hunger. So they do this quite regularly, and they do this without any control of the statistics office. As you can see, their report is by regime. So the past presidents with the current one are Estrada, Arroyo, Aquino, and Duterte now. And they regularly report this to inform specific officials of the self-rated hunger experience of our people. And currently, hunger is leveled. It is at the level of where it was when the past president stepped down. Actually, the statistics office also asks questions on hunger, but we don't release them in recognition of the fact that we have nonprofit organization reporting on hunger. We do our hunger report internally as a validation of the report of the particular nonprofit organization. So this is a report on hunger. If I may share with you, every time I go to our Congress for budget hearings, the main questions that they ask are, so how is economy performing? The other is, how about the poverty situation? They also ask about unemployment and underemployment, and they ask about inflation. Another question is hunger. And so we rely on this report of the nonprofit organization to report on hunger. Another example released is quality of life. So actually, they decided to go ahead with producing quality of life index. And if you look at the red part of the graph, quality of life, according to our people, is not doing well. So that's an alert to our government. Another example are quick surveys that they do to address certain current issues. So they are more agile and nimble in giving information on current situations. An example is the plan of the government to do drug testing even for primary students. And these are grade 4 students and up. And so there's an uproar, why are you going to do that to our children? And so this pollster did a quick survey of the opinions of our citizens. And for the whole country, that's unacceptable. But of course, you can see that in regions where our current president come from and nearby region, it seems that those who protest are much less than for the whole country. The Philippines is now going to do its national ID. So we are going to implement this national ID next year. The president signed the law in August. We produced the implemental rules and regulations in October. And the Philippine Statistics Authority is again in charge of implementing the Philippine identification system. In the past, there were many attempts to do a national ID system. The attempts actually came even before Estrada. They came from one of our presidents before him, Ramos. Then Arroyo attempted to also introduce, but they all didn't happen because of issue of privacy, government profiling and making surveillance of its citizens. So there are some people's groups that are really against this. But the president decided to go ahead, and this survey done again by our nonprofit organizations, Social Weather Stations, or SWS, released the report that 70% of Filipinos support the ID system. So this particular report is very vital to the implementation because now those that are opposing this have this information. that majority of us want this. And thus, the experience we're having is, in the beginning, there was a lot of protest, but when this result was released, the protests were not so much. So there's some silence, and there's a wait-and-see attitude as to how we will implement the national ID. So these are examples of citizen-generated data in the Philippines that help us tell the people and tell the government what they feel, what their feelings are. They are actually quick reports, which the official statistician cannot do because we have clear release calendars. We have clear calendar for the year, and it's not easy for us to just make a survey just to address a particular issue. If I may share with you, we are actually already addressing some of the concerns of our people. When we release inflation, we also release inflation of the bottom 30%. We also release information by the 17 regions, so the government knows the situation by region and by our regarding the poor. We recently also released the multidimensional poverty index, and we are reporting it as a deprivation report. So we looked at 5 dimensions of deprivation. We have education, health, housing, employment opportunities, and other services. And we have reported last month that in the past 2 years, there is some improvement, less deprivation from 2016 to 2017, but education, basic education is where most of our families are most deprived. In fact, the message is half of our Filipino families don't even have one household member that has finished high school. So that is something to think about for our government. Now, so I showed you examples of how citizen-generated data help address issues, inform government, and inform everyone of what's going on. But I mentioned to you that these are without coordination, without partnership of the Statistics Office. And thus, going forward, we are now actually discussing developing data ecosystems. So data ecosystem in the national level, in the subnational level, down to the municipal city level. And we find that for national and regional Philippines level and some provincial level, official statistics can already address the needs. But when we go down municipal level, we really need more help from our citizen-generated data. So we believe that citizen-generated data will augment the data gaps that are being, of the data that are being produced by the Statistics Office. But we need to reach out in a neutral space to talk about standards and to talk about not being in competition. So this is also a situation in the Philippines where sometimes citizen-generated data producers compete with official statistics. They give side comments like, okay, we're now releasing our hunger statistics, we are releasing self-rated poverty, and this is faster release than the Philippine Statistics Authority. So it is quite a difficult situation because we cannot, of course, debate with them, okay, you're doing 2,400 sample size nationwide with just one question of self-rated poverty, while the Statistics Office does 180,000 households sample with all the questions on income and consumption. So the moving forward really is positive openness, but we now are engaged with our professional society. We have actually 2 professional societies that we engage with really closely, the Statistics Association and the Demographers Population Association. And so this is where we believe we can have meetings to do some coordinations. Let's not compete. You can produce this, we can produce this, and that we can talk about standards. In the Philippines, any government agency that uses government funds to do a survey has to go through the survey clearance system of the statistics office. So they have to submit their plan, and we review their plan, we review the questionnaire to make sure that existing questions in other surveys are not repeated, no duplication, and the standards of our classification standards and definitions are also subscribed to. We don't have such, of course, for citizen-generated data producers and private sector. So it's exciting because we are assured that we don't need to produce everything, the statistics office. We have to have partners that can help us augment what we produce, but it should be in a partnership, positive atmosphere. So the bottlenecks really are coordination, agreeing that we have to have standards, and so that's where we are in the Philippines. Thank you very much.
No, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay, it's very good. Well, thank you, Lisa, for another exciting presentation. It seems that the National Statistical Offices, if you take just the two examples here, are very open to use citizen-generated data. You both spoke in very positive terms. I mean, agile, nimble. Lisa gave a lot of examples where citizen-generated data can make a difference and can help her in her current job. So it would be interesting to see if this sample of two official statistic representative is representative for the whole community, and there might be also countries where maybe the openness is a little bit less. And we will be hearing in a minute or so from our colleagues from the civil society representative, if I may say so, how open you are for this offer. I mean, there's a clear offer, there's a clear interest, and we will be hearing also later from you from the side of representatives of civil society. But before we hear from them, we are delighted to have Professor Kim Chung-Grak with us. He's with the Department of Statistics from the Pusan National University and the president of the Quran Statistical Society. Very interested to hear your perspective.
Thank you, Yanis. Well, I'm talking about so-called weekly health diary. That's my suggestion for application of CGD to well-being. I'm Chung-Rak Kim from Department of Statistics at Pusan National University. Well, two speakers already mentioned about CGD, but let me define very quickly about CGD. Data that people or their organizations produce to directly monitor, demand, or drive change on issues that affect them. And the goal is open up opportunities for increased collaboration between government and civil society on collecting and sharing data, on using data to monitor and enhance progress on sustainable development. And the property is that CGD is different from big data or social media data, which is indirectly created by citizens through interactions with media platforms. So there is much enthusiasm about the potential of CGD to raise citizens' voices and contribute to the society. But there is some disadvantage. It's a profound lack of trust and could be political and could be pressure group for their own benefits. Well, here is my suggestion, and the motivation is that when we play golf, putting is money, but in real life, data is money. So we should not disregard a very valuable data set. Well, for a long time, most individuals regard healthy life as the most important well-being in their lives. Everyone wants a healthy and long life. If people are healthy, then nation becomes a strong country and the government can save money in the medical insurance. But the current health system, the government to do citizens' health care, what the government to do? For older than 40 years aged citizen in Korea case, government provide a free health checkup biannually. And the current checkup list contains chest x-rays, blood pressure, urine and stool test, and some blood tests like cholesterol, GOT and GPT scores for liver, blood glucoses, simple test for seeing and hearing, a simple check for teeth, stomach and colon, endoscopy if necessary. And I want to suggest that the current health care or government for citizens are restricted to some severe disease like cancer. And we want to keep health when we are healthy. Hence, we need to enlarge the scope of care to healthy life and early detection of disease or cancer. And most people are very concerned about their current health status, and they do the following to lead healthy life. For example, food, they think about protein, body fat, glucose, carbohydrate, sugar, etc. And for the exercise, swimming, bicycling, climbing, yoga, and jogging. Now, the method that I propose is that for the government side, they provide a platform or portal called Weekly Health Diary and get information on health status of citizen and provide a specialized and personalized health guideline to each citizen regularly, for example, once a month. For the citizen side, we record the diary weekly. And for the hospital side, send medical information on the outpatient to the government portal. And the weekly health diary consists of the following format. Well, we need pseudo ID, age, gender, location, and height, and the date that we write diary, and the weight last week, food taken last week, and smoking or drinking last week, exercise last week, how many works, how many hours of dynamic exercises, how many hours of static exercises, and blood pressure, blood glucose, cholesterol if measured, and what is the existing disease, asthma, hemorrhoids, hypertension, diabetes, depression, dementia, atopy, arthritis, backache, cataract, glaucoma, hearing impairment, etc. And the question there is, during last week, was there blood in urine or stool? Was there some problem in digestion? How many times did you feel depressed? And how many times did you feel fatigue? Something like that. And the hospital records contain date, disease, clinical records. And there are some duties that's not so mandatory, but the government should provide a managed portal system, and provide descriptive statistics and summarize each individual's health information, give warning to individuals if necessary, and protect personal privacy. That's why I used pseudo ID instead of real ID. For the citizen side, we write the diary frankly every week, so that's not necessarily but recommended. And for the hospital side, provide all the clinical records of each citizen whenever they visit the hospital. Well, here is the anticipated effects. For the citizen side, by writing diary on health regularly, they concern about healthy life more than before and can be healthier than before and live longer and receive their current health status information without visiting hospital and receive this information for free. For the government side, easy to get health information on citizens, increase citizens' attention on health, reduce medical expenses, lead to a healthy society. Now, this is a summary and it's a platform structure. Here, citizen, here, government, and here, hospital. For the time being, currently, the only way is we visit when we are sick to the hospital, and that's all. And all the valuable data is forgotten. But by writing weekly health diary, the citizen's information goes to the government, and government provide health consulting report, and the hospital provides health exam result, and the hospital provides health exam result to the government also, and the government gives some diary report. All right, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for this very interesting and very concrete example. I think you said something very interesting also in the beginning. We tend sometimes to equate citizen-generated data with something generic positively. It reminded me of a discussion we had in the development field for some 20 years ago when the NGOs came up. And it was at that time, there was always the government-provided aid, which was labeled bad, and the civil society-provided aid was labeled necessarily good. And it turned out that we maybe need to be a bit more careful. And the same could be for citizen-generated data, because we know that some of the citizen-generated data comes naturally from pressure groups. It can be very well that groups are very well in organizing themselves, and they collect the data, and then they lobby for their specific interest, which is all fine, but maybe not in the wider interest of the society at large. One other consideration that came up in the discussion about smart cities, where somebody then said, well, we might also have a sample bias. As you know, these days there's a lot of cleavage between citizens and people living in peri-urban and urban areas and those living behind in the rural areas. We can see this all over the world, from France to the US, but also in developing countries. And now if we collect citizen-generated coming from the citizens themselves, we might get a lot of data from people living in urban areas, living in peri-urban areas, where the technology that we heard in the beginning is often necessary to produce that data, is in place. So we don't hear again yet from those are left behind in the rural areas, in the areas that are not served by necessarily the infrastructure. So possibly leading even to a reinforcement of existing bottlenecks and existing sort of disparities. But I'm very happy now to have two colleagues here from the civil society organization who will probably give us a very different picture. So let me call on Rebecca first. She's with the community, she's community partnership manager with the humanitarian OpenStreetMap, and she will give us a very interesting example about how through modern technologies we can actually reach those who are maybe most in need. Rebecca?
Perfect. Thanks so much, and also a huge thank you to Paris 21 for inviting us to give this kind of practitioner's perspective on CGD. So I'm going to talk about HOT, my organization, Humanitarian OpenStreetMap Team, and OpenStreetMap, and how we think kind of tools like this can be better harnessed to provide value for official statistics and official data users. So just a quick kind of point for anyone who is not kind of up to date with OpenStreetMap. You can think of it as the map version of Wikipedia. It's open, it's editable, and anyone can contribute to it. And it's built on the premise of you contribute about something you know very well. So for example, mapping the community that you live in. At HOT, we use this tool for humanitarian purposes, so trying to kind of close gaps for development or humanitarian organizations or projects which need better information. So just a quick example on how this works. So remote volunteers anywhere in the world can contribute what we call a base map. So if you look on the screen here, you can see a very simple example of tracing buildings and roads in satellite imagery. This can be as simple as kind of using a tool like Paint to draw lines and squares. And hundreds of thousands of volunteers all around the world can kind of contribute together to create a map of an area that's particularly vulnerable to a disaster or crisis or experiencing one right now. So this is the first stage. The second stage, and where the kind of color comes into the map, is communities based in these locations themselves adding data that only they know about their locations. So, all of us kind of know that the more detailed information you have, the better decisions you can make with it. This example is very simple. It's somebody simply adding information on building material, which is very important for kind of vulnerability to natural disasters or other programs. This is a malaria spray program example. And one thing that's really important to note is that these are all very adapted for low resource settings. So these tools work on smartphones that cost as little as $30. Increasing smartphone penetration has really changed the way in which citizens can create data about themselves, as mentioned by other people. And they also work offline, which is quite critical for a lot of the locations that we're working in. So just to share an example of what this looks like. So this is around kind of achieving the SDGs. I think there's a bit of a difference between citizen-generated data to achieve the SDGs and citizen-generated data to measure the SDGs. And I think achieving is probably the lower-hanging fruit because you have a huge bunch of programs which have a very near-term and very real data need. So this is around Goal 3, Target 3.3, which is around elimination of diseases. Malaria is one of them. And this is a program I was working on in Guatemala a few weeks ago, where there's 4 million local cases of malaria every year. However, the government has a goal to eliminate these by 2020, which isn't something they can really achieve without great data. So what we want to do is harness the potential of this person in this image here who has relatively low literacy, has used a smartphone a few times and a tablet kind of never before. How can this person create data that is genuinely useful for a government department? The good news is that normally they're creating data anyway. So as they go about their roles, this person is in the malaria spray team. They're creating data on paper. How can that be kind of transformed into something which is useful at scale? So this program has two parts. Firstly, conducting a census, which is obviously kind of very, very up to date. There is census information, but it's quite out of date in this location. And then secondly, trying to understand whether a spray or bed nets would be a better solution to malaria for that particular community. So you can see here just a really quick example. I've chosen a very good example of the hand-drawn map on the left-hand side. There are a lot which are significantly worse quality than this. However, this is a kind of map that someone would draw as they are standing in the field trying to kind of draw what's around them. And whilst firstly data quality is one issue, it's also secondly the thing that these kind of spray teams say they like the least about their jobs because they know it's not that accurate, it's really difficult, and they know they're missing stuff out and there's nothing they can do about that. On the other image, you can see what sort of happens when we use these very simple tools. So in the green, you can see all the buildings that were covered by the program. In red, you can see programs where the residents did not want to be covered, and you can learn certain information about that. Like, why did someone reject a malaria spray is a really important piece of information in terms of being able to do education and outreach programs to improve the coverage of the program in following years. And then also in the orange, you can see these are buildings that actually the people living and working in those communities didn't actually know existed, but they were impacting malaria control because they're within the 2-kilometer radius of a mosquito. So if you don't know that they're there, then you also have a bit of a challenge in the sense that you're kind of doing everything you can for this program, but it might not necessarily be working. Just to share another really simple example of this, we're working a lot on the refugee crisis in Uganda, 1.5 million refugees who've crossed the border from South Sudan in the past couple of years. And one of the biggest issues is access to safely managed drinking water. So you can see here community members. In this case, this is both a refugee and a member of the host community mapping together. I think that's really important because Just saying something is there does not mean that someone has access to it. And we all know that kind of access to services for refugees isn't as simple as being near to a service. They can also get a whole bunch of information around the functionality of these points. So for example, these water points, firstly, you can actually get immediate insight into who has access to this water, but secondly, where are the places where there's quite simple fixes that could be made, like fixing handles on pumps. So in terms of how this is relevant to both an SDG and national agenda, roughly a quarter of the SDG indicators are fairly expressly geospatial, especially the proportion of population indicators. So, these cover all sorts of things: proportion of population with access to a library, proportion of population with access to electricity. These are really difficult to measure unless you know where the people are and where the services are. So obviously from a geospatial perspective, I think that's really important. But the other thing I think that's really critical, and that some of our previous panelists touched on around how CGD and official statistics could work together, is that a huge part of the SDG agenda is leave no one behind, and a lot of CGD projects, they're actually getting like the bees in behind to contribute data about themselves. So we can make a whole variety of arguments about why this is potentially better. It's ethical, it's low cost, it can happen with certain frequency. However, I think there's also a huge argument for the fact that the data is better when it comes from that community. For very good reasons, those communities often evade other forms of kind of attempts to capture data around them, because often that data has been used against them, right? If someone kind of maps your house and then bulldozes it, it doesn't hugely increase your confidence in kind of contributing to official statistics and kind of more formal processes. Whereas I think actually engaging citizens in creating information about themselves can lead to much more high quality data. And then just quickly on the national agenda, CGD is typically problem focused. So there's kind of quite good examples from local government around use and uptake of CGD, which makes a lot of sense, right? Because it's relevant to an issue happening in their location. Things like kind of reporting public waste would be a really common example there. And it's quick and it's frequent, and typically it's more disaggregated, which obviously I know is a bit of a buzzword in this community, but is a buzzword for a reason, in that it's very valuable. And then, not to kind of repeat the words of any of my previous panelists, but in terms of moving forward, I really highly agree with this focus on complementing each other. It's very unhelpful for an organization to kind of produce information that's conflicting with official statistics and not be clear about why. I think, for example, when you mentioned asking just one question, that can be really quite challenging, and I think sometimes we're kind of shifting from, typically in citizen-generated data, there's been this focus on data being like good enough for a reason. Is this data the base information I could use to plan a healthcare intervention? That's an incredibly different context to an official statistics office trying to use CGD, and we shouldn't pretend that they're the same. We should acknowledge that not everything is a good fit. There's a lot of questions which probably aren't best answered by CGD, and I think we need to be honest about what those are. And I think the comments on standards are really, really important, and they're something that needs to be contributed to from both sides. Personally, I mean, standards it's a big term and it could take a long time. There could be some very simple and quick work done around, what are we going to say is our checklist for good practice? And can we just kind of set up something relatively simple that then a project could use to say, hey, like, this is decent data and you can have trust in it because I followed these, relatively simple methodology recommendations. I think those kind of activities would probably lead to kind of easier collaboration between the two groups. And then finally, we've been kind of convening a group of people to talk about this and share more of their experience in CGD. It's through the Global Platform for Sustainable Development Data, and it's a group of both practitioners but also people who want to get more involved in actually using CGD. So please, if you'd like to join that, send me an email, because any and all contributions are really helpful. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for this engaging presentation, and also for being quite honest at the end, saying not this is fantastic only, but you also pointed out to some challenges with respect to the reliability of the data that citizens might produce, and also for providing us with very concrete examples. The other point I took away from your presentation, which we have to be in mind, is, and we haven't really talked about this in a conceptual way, citizen-generated data, at which level are we talking? Are we talking the community level? Are we talking a regional level? Are we talking the national level? And another important point you made is about the finalité. So what is it all about? Is it for, as you said, SDG implementation? Is it for action? Is it for producing, helping, augmenting official statistics? Is it to hold governments to account? What is the purpose of it? And I think we will come back to those points also during the discussion. So, but it helps a lot to maybe structure also the debate in terms of going forward. So our last but not least but not last speaker is our colleague from Techo, Uruguay. She's Belén González, the executive director, and we are very pleased to have you with us to listen to another example. Belén?
Thank you very much. Well, I'm really pleased to be here. I think I'm one of the few Latin American, so I feel like obligated to tell you a little bit about our work and the reality around some of the countries of our Latin America. Techo is a civil society organization that works bringing together young volunteers and communities living in poverty in informal settlements to proper social transformation through strengthening the community capacities to promote the exercise of citizenship. Mainly through improving the conditions of habitability and habitat, and the promotion of economical and social development. To promote this citizenship participation, we work with volunteers in over 20 years in 19 countries in Latin America. We have mobilized more than 1 million volunteers, built more than 115 transitional houses, and work in more than 600 communities. I was thinking how could be the best way of imagining well-being in 5, 10, 15 years, like it was promoted in this conference. And I would like to tell you a little bit as a metaphor, which could actually help to picture the reality that we see every week in every neighborhood that we work. I'm from Uruguay, so the example comes from there. If we gather together all the people that live in informal settlements in Uruguay, the population of the state, let's call it informal settlement, would be the third state in population of the country. This state would have a very young population, since 49% of its inhabitants would be children and teenagers under 20 years old, and only a few would reach 65-year-old. That could be the 2.5%. It could be a state with an ethical diversity like no other in the country, since 20% could recognize themselves as African American and 9% as descendant of indigenous people. With respect to labor rights, only half of the workers would enjoy such recognition, since the other half would work under conditions of informality. 40% of the families, composed by 4 people, could have an income of less than $300 a month. On top of all this, the responsibility of these households could be in the 77 cases of women. All of this in a country that is classified as high income by the World Bank and with the best socio-economical indicators of the region. The country with the best quality of life in the continent, the highest formal employment rate in the region, with the lowest housing deficit in the region. A country that has systematically reduced poverty measurement by income method in the last 13 years. 2 years ago, we made a campaign to make visible this reality that we see from Techo every week. And while we were filming during the spot with people from different settlements where we work, they had to present these measurements, and they ended up saying, I also want to live in Uruguay. In this way, the people were laughing. They couldn't believe that the numbers were real. They thought we were making some kind of a joke. In this way, these inhabitants of different informal settlements were teaching us what it means that an indicator doesn't explain your reality, that in the averages and the comparisons, a series of unfair and unequal realities seem to fade away. This idea that I'm trying to share with you goes beyond borders of a country. The averages and the information sometimes in national levels blur the harsh realities that exist in informal settlements all across Latin America. So focusing on the idea that frames the conversation, the future of well-being, if we don't start putting the most excluded territories in the center of the investigations, the discussions, the public policies, if we don't prioritize this in public and private agenda, the future will continue to be unequal. This metaphor, this idea that I gave you of Uruguay, it's only from 20 settlements that we actually work in. But the experience has shown us that even though Latin America is very diverse and we cannot say generalizations, the reality in informal settlements is very dramatic for the 104 million people living in them. So why is that reality not so important, or why is not public policies focus on them? And we discover although 1 every 4 citizens in Latin America live in informal settlements, it's maybe not the biggest issue that we recognize as a continent. And this is because we don't have enough information of the region that objectively gives information to make decisions. So we are trying to do a first step in contributing to solve the problem. And we should build data and information about this invisible reality to make it visible the violation of rights in these territories, to monitor public policy and to give information so public policy can be focused on these territories, to empower citizenship by knowing the reality of their neighborhoods and trying to dialogue with the government and NGOs about how to improve their rights. And we are working, it's not longer a proposal, we're already working on it, in a platform that integrates, visualizes, and make accessible information to settlements in all main cities in Latin America by 2021. And we are taking advantage of something that we have done in our 20 years, that is training volunteers and knowing the territory. We're taking that advantage in order to aim this platform that will be open data in order to contribute to the construction and improve the quality of life of 104 million Latin America living in slums.
Thank you very much for another interesting example about the situation, about these informal settlements and how citizen-generated data can draw attention to a phenomena that maybe official statistics has difficult to grasp fully. So basically providing additional information for public policy making, I think is very important. Now, I look at the time. We have still some good 20 minutes for our conversation, and so please get ready, already think about the questions. But I wanted to just trying summarizing where we stand and then maybe ask a follow-up question, maybe to the two camps that we have here, the National Statistical Office representatives, and then we have the neutral judge, and then we have the two representatives of the civil society organization. So in an imaginative role play, so we would be all living in one country, and you would representing the statistical office side, and you would be representing the civil society. So why, I mean, we heard so many good things about the potential of you working with them. What needs to happen concretely? I mean, what are for the low-hanging fruit from your perspective? When would you like, or what needs to happen that you share the data that you are both currently collecting with your respective institutions? When would you share, or why would you share, and how would you share the data with Lisa and Jane? What are the next very concrete steps that this is going to happen? Rebecca, would you like to start?
Yeah, so I think this is kind of a point on why you would give it to someone else and also why you would keep doing it. Citizens want to see impact from information they're contributing, right? So if for example, the road I live on isn't paved, right? If I could tag that and I know that someone is watching that and is going to come and do something about it, I'm going to do it more often. So personally, I would really advocate for, I think citizen-generated data always has to be actively contributed by the citizen. I actually think it's quite irresponsible to passively mine data and use that to represent citizen opinions. One very simple example would be like, I don't tag road issues and public space on my Twitter, and I do tag a cafe I walk into if they tell me they'll give me a free drink when I do that. Like, people contribute what they think people are listening to, and so I think there has to be a call for, like, this is the impact that will come from you contributing this information, for people to do it in the first place, and then to keep doing it when they see that impact coming. And then from a more kind of, not from the citizen perspective, from the, like, how can these two groups work together, I think there needs to be just a way better understanding of, you know, these questions around, like, what is it good for, what scale is it good for, and who is it good for? There are loads of fabulous examples, but I don't think that there's a great framework that they are feeding into right now. And that is a bit of a challenge, because it means it's very hard for someone else to pick up and use, because they need to know a huge amount about the project in order to really understand it and trust it. There's no framework that helps you kind of take like a bird's eye view on that.
Mm-hmm. Belen, you want to add to this point?
To add something, when I hear you, I hear like very modern office statistics, and with an open mind to collaboration. And what happens when those offices don't work the same in every country and don't have the same kind of information? And I'm thinking that the bigger the necessity in the countries, the more we have to understand the need of collaboration. I have here in this event a lot of times that there's a lot of information. And in some countries there is not so much information. And we need to collaborate to build the best information to act, to do things. And this reality I just try to present to you. We don't have located information from informal settlements in Latin America. It's a huge thing. And National Statistic Office don't have this information. We are trying to build it, and we're trying to do a collaborative work. An example is Argentina, that already finished their part of the duty, and it started being an internal project of Techo, and it ended up being a work between government, Techo, and other organizations that were working in the fields that needed to be surveyed. So I think there is a huge opportunity if we understand that the needs of building this information, it's very important in going step forward in the human rights, asegurarse, making sure like human rights.
So what basically comes out, it's the local context and the specific country context will matter a lot. So I think from that perspective, it might be good to look at what we tend to say as good practice cases in this world where maybe something has already happened, and to document those good practices and to understand why they have happened, or maybe also looking at some failures if we can, to understand what are the essential ingredients to really harness the citizen-generated data in a public space. But now turning to our colleagues from the official statistics side, so in our imaginary country that we are just currently living, so you just heard the office, so there's a lot of data on informal settlements, on the case studies about malaria and so on that is given to you, Lisa. Will you use it? Will you just make use of it? And how will you relate to this kind of gentle offer?
I'm thinking of where citizen-generated data can really be used by the government, by the public, and so there are different users of the citizen-generated data. My opinion is some citizen-generated data could be used by official statistics to augment data gaps. But some citizen-generated data need not be submitted to the statistical system. You can actually produce them on your own, the way it happens in the Philippines, because they would have different purposes. So if the purpose is to help the statistical system to provide the data for monitoring the country's SDG accomplishments, for example, then we can come together and ask each one, what data can you put on the table? What data can we have? And are they interoperable? Can we put them together? So this is where we discuss standards. But there are some citizen-generated data are there for public good. And so they can continue to be generated. As long as it's very clear how different the concepts are from the concepts that are used by statistics. So a very good example I have is the Philippines officially produces the quarterly labor force statistics on unemployment and underemployment using international standards. But we have these social weather stations. They also produce on a quarterly basis what they call the joblessness report, which is a different concept, joblessness. So as long as it's clear how they explain it, I believe that's still okay. As I keep saying, the statistics office is not a censor. We don't censor, but of course, if the concepts we're using are used inappropriately and the data we're using, then we have to say something. And it could be possible that inconsistencies of citizen-generated data and official statistics is because you have a different target population from the report of the statistics. So I believe if we dialogue, we can explain these inconsistencies. And so it gives the full picture of our people. So in the Philippines, we produce the national, the sub-regional, and some provincial perspectives. But in my mind, when we go municipal level, we have the census results and administrative records. But this is really where citizen-generated data is useful for the country.
Jane, I think I wanted to bring in one aspect that might help in this context to see what needs to be put in place. And this is the term that actually you just mentioned is capacity development. And the needed change, I think there's a lot of capacity that needs to be created on both sides, from the statistical office side and from the side maybe of the users. And incidentally, Paris 21, I do a little bit self-promotion for our own work. We just created a new framework, Capacity Development 4.0, which basically is putting the finger on some of the things that you have been saying on the data use, on the capacities of national statistical offices to engage into a dialogue with the users more effectively than maybe in the past, and not just stop at the production stage, but go to the dissemination stage. And I think, and this brings me to Jane and the statistical office in Canada. I understood that your office had done a very smart thing in the sense of not lecturing the civil society and saying this is bad data or not, but providing a tool that they can go to the website and they can download this tool and have an own assessment about the usefulness of the data for their context. So you seem to step a little bit away of putting a label, it's high quality or low quality, you provide a tool. Maybe you want to say a few things about this?
I mean, I think as we modernize a statistical agency to be relevant and keep being relevant, we need to think of how do we do our business better. We have that knowledge around and that capacity around how to do data, how to do those standards, et cetera, how to have good quality information needed for evidence-based decision making. But we're not in it by ourselves. And I think there's a real need, and we're certainly seeing it in Canada, to build capacity to use data. We hear data's everywhere. But how does the ordinary citizen, or how does the community level or municipality or other organizations use data? And so that's a leadership role of the national statistical agencies. And I'm really, that's what we feel. We need to be out there giving those tools. We have a tool now to sort of assess different types of data, but also to build capacity to use the data and understand where it is good or bad, or how can you use data in a very simple way or a more complex way. We need to be transparent about that. So we're even thinking about going into schools now, doing educational outreach. We used to have a program, we're getting back into it, working with school boards across the country, helping teachers teach about data and how children can learn and get those skills. So, I mean, I think it's the role of the statistical agency in order to be relevant.
Let me also bring in the professor. I mean, you had at the end of your nice presentation, you had showed us this diagram, government, hospital, citizens, and there was a nice flow of information and about your weekly healthy diet, which is, if I'm a citizen that don't want to eat healthy, I enjoy drinking my beer, I enjoy drinking, so is there any, I mean, in terms of, that could be perceived as a bit paternalistic from the state. I know what is good for you. But maybe as a citizen, I don't care. I want to live my own life. I want to behave like I would like to do. So is that challenging your model? I mean, do everybody then has to obey to this model that you were designing for us?
Yeah. Well, in Korea, SNS survey and comments are very frequent and popular. However, the CGD are relatively sparse. And further, Koreans do not give much confidence or credit on the results from the CGD because the agenda is quite sensitive to political issues. So I think, as I said before, CGD should not be disturbed or polluted by politicians. And CGD should not be used as a pressure group for their own benefits. And the goal of CGD should be pure and innocent, and for the well-being of the whole people, not just a special group of people. So as a statistician, also president of the Korean Statistical Society, I wrote an article in the daily newspaper and attended 2 forums organized by members of parliament as a panel. At that time, I emphasized neutrality, independence, and professionalism of statistics. The main message was, let the data speak for themselves. And statistics should not be a maid of power. Now, some members of parliament will legislate to guarantee the term of appointment of the Commissioner of Statistics Korea. I think that might improve neutrality, independence, and professionalism of statistics. So the so-called weekly health diary I think that's one way of cooperation between citizen-generated data and government-generated data. And we deliberately engage in that movement, I suggest.
Very good. Now it's time to bring you in. So can I see, please, a sign of hand? Who wants to ask a question, make a comment? I see the gentleman just at the... so we take a couple of questions. With your permission, we will collect a couple of questions. I'm fairly aware of time, so if you give us maybe 5 minutes more, if your hunger this still allows us, your well-being. So we would maybe end at 1:10, if that's okay. Just to see a couple of questions and then to wrap up the discussion. Please, can you just introduce yourself?
Sure. Tony German from Development Initiatives. First, I'd like to say thanks to Paris 21 and to the panelists for a very interesting and substantive discussion. Thinking about the Leave No One Behind agenda, which the Secretary-General emphasized yesterday in the context of well-being, and in particular, the commitment to reaching the furthest behind first, Martin Ravalian, who knows more about reaching the poorest than most people, he's the man that came up with the term $1 a day, says we just don't have enough data on those people who are living at what he calls the consumption floor, the very poorest people. So I'd like to hear from the panel their thoughts about how maybe national statistical offices and civil society organizations, who often claim to be working with the very poorest, can help to fill in this important data gap so that we can focus on raising the floor to increase the well-being of the very poorest people. Thank you.
This is actually a very good question. I mean, I happen to be a development economist, and one of the things that Tony was alluding to, that we often focus on the people who are just at the borderline of the $1 per day, and then we try to move them beyond poverty. But the ultra poor, the chronic poor, the really super disputed, it's very difficult to measure. So maybe from your perspective, how can your work, to sort of, and they maybe also in these areas where it's difficult to work, difficult for you to go, and difficult maybe also for you to establish sort of the necessary tools. So that's a very important question. Can I see the lady, just in the, yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for some great examples. I'm Pippa Coots, I'm from Carnegie UK Trust. I really like the point at the end about the necessity of being relevant. And I think we're finding in the UK anyway that as our policy becomes much more about partnership and co-production, the evidence base or the way in which evidence and data is generated is not really keeping up with that policy landscape. So I just wondered if you want to say anything more about how, as we go on into this journey of co-production, co-design of services, how you think that people like yourselves who are evidence producers, how you think you can work more with the communities in order to come together to make decisions about service redesign, for example.
Excellent. Maybe one more question. Can I, the gentleman in the...
Hi, this is Min Kim. Thank you for the lecture about the CG data, and I'm pretty interested about data sharing. And you already mentioned how to share the data with the people. And my question is, I think the developing data and the sharing data are most important part for the people. And the question is, who is the leader to data collecting and data sharing? I think the leader has some kind of a responsibility to collect and sharing. So I'm wondering, there are people from the statistician of department, and there are the people from the citizens. So I'm wondering who would be a leader for that.
Any last urgent question? Otherwise, I give the gentleman, and then we close the just.
네, 과학기술정책연구원의 강희종이라고 합니다. 통계는 이제 지속적으로 산출하는 게 대단히 중요하다고 생각하는데요. 시민단체가 생산하는 그 데이터의 경우에 지속성 확보가 좀 어려울 것 같다는 생각이 드는데 이러한 지속성 부족을 어떻게 보완할 수 있을지에 대해서 말씀을 해주시면 좋을 것 같습니다. 감사합니다.
Okay, just to repeat the question, I think a very important point that always comes up also in the context of big data, it's for national statistical offices, you are asked to produce data across a longer timeline with the same quality. And as we know with big data, we don't necessarily know, will Facebook continue to exist? So if we rely everything on Facebook or Twitter, it might just collapse. And then how do we do with the data? And I understood the question in the same way. So if we rely on citizen-generated data as an instrument, what about sustainability? What about time series? So thank you for these great questions. So what I would suggest is each of you will have now maybe 1 minute to address the question that you feel most at heart, or to add anything that you wanted to say, that you took away from this conversation. And then I will wrap up and we can all go for lunch, if that's okay. So maybe we start with Belen. Do you want to sort of conclude with any kind of concluding comment, a takeaway when you go back to Uruguay? What do you take away from this conversation? What will you do? Will you do something differently? Belen?
First of all, I would like to answer the first question.
That is very good, yeah.
I'm talking about the context that I live and work, that it's Uruguay, and I can talk a little bit about Latin America. The people who suffer more vulnerability and discriminations are subscribed in the territory in places. So if we go to the field, if we go to the ground, we can build the information from the territory and with the people. In this example of Argentina that I told you before, some of the people who gathered information were people from the community. So I think we have a huge opportunity to go forward in building information from people living in informal settlements. What would I take home from all this? I think I'm not an statistician myself, so I have learned a lot. And being an organization that is taking its first steps in building information, I take a lot of what the Statistics Office of National, the Philippines and Canada have said in order to establish better conversations with the national offices. I think we have to come together to generate greater opportunities. What else? And I think something that comes to my head also is that point of the forum governance in a complex world, and also with the question that has just been said about who's the leader. I think we are thinking again how to govern should be in our country and in the world. So I think it's quite interesting to think how the information should be how should information should be available, and who should have the possibility to use that information in order to drive change, thinking that 2030 is not that far away from today.
Rebecca?
Yeah, just to, I think, add on one quick point to that, and then I'll move to a different question. I totally agree with you that there's a lot of inconsistency in how people talk about getting data on the poorest. So, for example, I think it would be very short-sighted of me to assume that someone without access to food is going to spend their free time contributing to mapping, right? Because that's just not realistic. But I think there are ways in which we can incentivize their contribution without biasing the data. I think that's very important. And secondly, I think we need to get rid of this idea that like one community leader can provide data on behalf of their community. So for example, like we have seen a lot of programs, especially kind of with the sort of village leader kind of model that you see in a lot of African settlements, around like the village chief can provide data on their village, but like they as the village chief do not experience a lot of the issues that people in their village face. So I think that there needs to be a better understanding that things like that are quite irresponsible in terms of data production. But then to switch quickly to talk about this thing on sharing data. First, I mean, everything that we do in OpenStreetMap is open source. And by open source, I don't just mean openly available, like it's openly editable, which I think is quite an important proponent of open source. But the points that I think were really well raised by our official statistics colleagues were around the purpose of data. Like, it's very irresponsible for me to create data on something and then go to official statistics and be like, hey, you need to use it for this, it's better than what you've got already, when the purpose I created it for is not the same. Like, creating data on joblessness is not the same as reporting on unemployment, and we should be honest about that, because maybe there's other ways it can help. But I think from the other side, official statistics, I don't have a background in official statistics, but my understanding is a lot of projects which are creating citizen-generated data with some very small changes could be creating data which is helpful for official statistics, and that link is not well taken advantage of right now. Because, I mean, citizen-generated data projects are innovations that have come into the arena of talking about official statistics because of the fact that the SDGs have presented a data challenge. So there's all this stuff that is now needs to be measured on that wasn't measured on before, and what are the potentials we can use for that? And obviously CGD is, you have a lot of capacity from citizens, so how can we harness them effectively? And I think that it would be great to see more programs and more funding for an NSO, for example, to advise people who are already doing this stuff, but they're just not doing it quite well enough, but they really easily could be. So personally, I think that would be a great step forward in terms of being able to harness citizen capacity. Is like NSO, it's just not constructive to try to undermine other data sources. It's much better to say, how can we work better together so that we can share this between different parties.
Thank you. Professor, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, well, for the sustainability of CGD, I think CGD should not be mandatory, but spontaneously. So that's not required stuff, I think. Also, for the message of CGD that is already collected, I think these statisticians should analyze those data, whether it contains some fake or ingenuine data. So that means we have to analyze whether the data is quite reliable or not. So we have to measure the degree of confidence on the data before producing the result from the CGD. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Lisa, any concluding
Well,
related to questions?
there should be clarity on each one's role. There should be clarity on what CGD can offer. There should be trust. Trust of citizens who give data to data collectors, trust between official statistics and non-official statistics. And bottom line is ethics of handling the data should be maintained by all. I believe if we are in that particular environment, this discussion of the use of CGD will really move forward. I believe we're still in this phase of really clarifying what CGD can do for monitoring lives of people. And who should take the lead? I believe it should be government, because we are the one, well, official statistics offices in particular, because we are the ones created by law to provide data for the country. So it's incumbent on us to reach out and build the trust, maintaining ethics, professionalism, and clarity. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Jane?
Well, a lot to think about, and it's been really quite interesting. I think, I always say, we don't produce data for ourselves at a statistical agency. We produce it for others. open dialogue and working with others is so key. When we do a census in Canada, we have to reach the most remote areas in this country, the most vulnerable populations. We don't do it alone. We have to engage often community leaders. You look at what we do with our Indigenous people. We hire Indigenous people to help us conduct a census. So it's a national involvement, and it's down to the local level. I think this, in terms of being relevant, and I took a lot what I heard about doing no harm. Our data cannot do harm. In order to be there, we need community groups, other organizations, citizens to help us, guide us. What do we collect? How do we collect it? How do we do it together? And in terms of consistency of data, I deal with this probably every day because I get a lot of administrative data from different jurisdictions in Canada on a range of topics, a range of social justice, health, you name it. It's sometimes a challenge even with provincial or state jurisdictions getting the data. It's all around mutual benefit, working together, understanding why it's important that we can get the data in order then to give the data, to provide data back as knowledge to inform policy and evidence-based decision making.
Well, I think we're coming closely to an end. As you said, I think this was a really very interesting session. I also learned quite a lot. I have 3 takeaways for myself that I wanted to share at the end very quickly. First is the citizen-generated data business. We are just at the beginning. It's not the end. It's not the end of the beginning of the end, but the end of the beginning of the conversation. We had a lot of discussions in the statistical community with the use of big data and the access to corporate data. And to some extent, all these discussions were quite a bit disappointing so far because we haven't seen the access to the corporate data. And the big difference, it seems, from the discussion so far that we heard, there's much more scope, potentially, with accessing citizen-generated data under a lot of things that we have to think about, and they have come out very clearly. I mean, it's not an easy solution. We talked about ethics, trust, standards, quality. So it's not an easy, but I think, and this is the second point, at least here on the panel, there was so much openness to listen to each other. There was so much openness to take on these kind of things. And as we are all aware, this might be different in different locations. But the opportunities were clearly spelled out. And it was also clearly spelled out that it's one thing to use citizen-generated data to augment official statistics. Another thing is to have citizen-generated data by itself and maybe have a sort of quality check through the statistical office on a voluntary basis. It's another thing maybe to think about capacity development on both ends, on the end of the producers and on the end of the users, and to commonly maybe think about in this new world of new data ecosystem that Lisa was mentioned, how each of us can have its role. And I think I'm speaking here from the official statistics side. I think worldwide official statistics is under threat. That's very clear. I mean, there's funding threats. There's a lot of threat coming from the demand side saying official statistics is not speaking to me. It's not my GDP type of argument. I don't agree with it, even if it's produced with the best intention. So maybe reaching out from a national statistical office, teaming up with citizens could help them to re-engage with very important supporters for them. So I think for the National Statistical Office, this is something that we have to think about. And last but not least, so what's coming next? What are the next steps that we could maybe jointly do? I think this is the beginning. I think it would be good to have, as an academic to some extent, and my colleague professor would probably agree, it would be nice to have a scoping paper, a nice summary paper that scopes a little bit the literature review, where do we stand, and sort of does a summary of the literature, the pros and cons, which would be, I think, quite helpful for a discussion. Then we should also have like an inventory. It would be interesting for different countries to have just an inventory of citizen-generated data, the different data sources, And to have this as a tool, if the civil society groups are comfortable with this, so to close the information gap. I think in many countries, this might be an interesting idea, but the people don't know from each other. There's a National Statistical Office sitting in his office, and you sit in your offices, you don't talk to each other. So helping to break those barriers, break those silos, could be very powerful. And then last but not least, thinking about some interesting pilots. And that's something Paris 21 wants to do at our little small scale, to think about a pilot where maybe for this very purpose of bringing official statistics in contact with civil society organization, for maybe producing augmented, and we talked about this in the Philippines, but we could also think about Uruguay and a couple of other countries where we could pilot this also with others. So I think we have a lot of things to do, but before we do a lot of things, I think it's time to say thank you to the audience for your great engagement, and in particular thanks to all the panelists for their fantastic contributions. Thank you very much, and I wish you a great lunch and a nice afternoon. Thank you very much.